So anyway, remember
By the way, we
back
are now, sorry, we are now officially recording. I realized we forgot to say this.
ah,
So go ahead, David.
not a problem. Okay, back in 2014, the Core Infrastructure Initiative was kicked off to identify critical projects and try to help them out in some way. Um, I was asked to do a quick run, and so I had done an early survey, which we called the Census One, for lack of, for because there was perception that speed was important. We focused on Linux distro packages, but obviously that leaves out a huge number of packages that are downloaded and installed via language level package managers. Um, and so more recently, Harvard was asked to take a look, and we actually did do some early research into how to use dependency data to try to identify important language level packages. Um, Linux Foundation then asked Harvard to go ahead and drill down that further. Harvard basically took two things. They did use dependency data, but they also went out and contacted SCA vendors and through a lot of effort to try to get that data, which was painful and hard, they came up with some interesting results. So the key people that are going to be speaking today are Frank Nagel. Say hi, Frank.
Hello.
And Jenny Hoffman. You're there
Hello.
somewhere. Hey, there we go. Okay. Um, so please take it away. Oh, actually, I'm sorry, Kim. First step. Did you? I'm sorry. I just started getting. I got into the role, but this is your meeting. So, do you want us to just go into that?
You're muted, Kim.
Yes. This is the first thing on our agenda today. So we are ready when you are.
Great. So yes. So thanks so much. David gave a good background there. And today I'll give an overview of kind of where we are and where we're planning on heading. And I'll throw a deck up here, but this is mostly just to kind of make sure we don't miss anything. And so obviously feel free to jump in and ask any questions along the way, because we consider this more of a conversation than just kind of a straight up presentation. So my name is Frank Nagel. I'm a professor at Harvard Business School. My background is actually in cybersecurity. I worked in the industry for about a decade before going back into the academic world. And now I study crowdsourcing, in particular open source software and how companies interact with these types of communities. Also, as David mentioned, is Jenny Hoffman, who I'll save her the trouble of taking herself off mute, but she works at the Laboratory for Innovation Science at Harvard, which is a group that's essentially a research laboratory that studies a variety of topics, but one of them in particular is crowds and communities. And so she and I have been working closely on this for the last, as David pointed out, about a year and a half or so. And we'll kind of go through. And Jenny, obviously, feel free to jump in if I misspeak or misstate anything. So as David mentioned, the early kind of projects that the first version of this was the Census 1.0, which they kind of took and started looking at kind of the most critical packages and how packages are used throughout the Linux environment. And the goal of the census, or one of the goals of the Census 2, was to take a broader picture of open source and be as broad as possible. So along those lines, just to kind of anchor ourselves on what the project is trying to do, we're really trying to understand three aspects of free and open source software. So the first is the prevalence, which the census is really the primary venue or avenue for attempting to do that. The second, which we'll talk about a survey that we've been running as well, kind of after we talk about the census stuff. And so the impact, we're thinking about the criticality of various pieces of open source, but in kind of how it's used, but also in kind of its economic impact. And then as a piece of that, we're also thinking about how we prioritize open source efforts to address security vulnerabilities. So some of you may have seen seen, or you may have talked about the EU, or the European Commission kind of set up a bug bounty program for open source, but the way that they decided which, how to target what pieces of open source was really just based on what the European Commission used themselves. So we're trying to give some guidance to the EU, the US government is interested in this, and then of course organizations like the OSSF that are interested in supporting open source. We're really trying to help kind of give a prioritized list based on at least one measure of impact and importance to the world, essentially. And then lastly, we're also trying to think about endurance and how open source is not developed in a vacuum. It's created by a community of some volunteers, some paid people, and various people with different incentives and different time and ability to support the community. And so I'll talk towards the end about a survey that we just wrapped up recently that really tries to look at kind of the human side of all of this. And so thinking about, what people are doing now in terms of developing open source and how we can help them kind of bake in norms and best practices from, a lot of the things we've learned from kind of private software development and also things that have emerged from kind of bigger projects, like Linux and Apache and the various larger open source practices, and how do we help kind of the smaller projects that have become, later become super important, how do we help them bake these practices in from the beginning, even if they're small. And so, and David mentioned 2014, where a lot of these efforts from Linux and others started. I'm sure we're probably all familiar with Heartbleed, but, one of the interesting things here is that was, in general, kind of a fairly small project with a small number of contributors. And it just became super important, right? OpenSSL became super important and critical. And so, how do we kind of identify these projects that are, core to the underpinnings of the internet and really the modern economy, and provide the support both in terms of technical, but also kind of social and other things like that they really need. And so, how are we doing this? As I mentioned, I'll talk kind of first about the SCAs. So as mentioned in the chat, SCA can stand for either software composition analysis or source code analysis, so essentially kind of the same thing. But what these companies do is essentially go into client companies and analyze the code that they're using for a variety of reasons. Sometimes it's for picking up potential vulnerabilities, but often it's about license violations, right? So ensuring that when a company is building its own proprietary code, they're not violating any open source licenses or other types of licenses in the software that they're building. And so these SCAs are a useful place for us to start because they have insights into what thousands of companies are using in their software. And so we kind of started by working with them because they're, I wouldn't call them gatekeepers, but they're essentially by tapping into them, we get insights into what thousands of companies are doing without needing to talk directly to all those thousands of often smaller, but sometimes bigger companies. And so we can really see, kind of this broad and deep view of what's being used in terms of open source. Yes, so that's kind of what this Census 2 is based around, is working with these SCAs to see what types of open source software their clients use, and these are kind of global companies and global clients. And so we have, our goal is to really take this to a very broad kind of definition of open source, and also a broad measure of kind of the use of open source. And so with this project, one of our goal is not to have this just be kind of a one-time thing and just kind of say, this is the state of the world at the moment, but actually have it be something that is updated on kind of a yearly basis in a way that, maintains the privacy and protects the customers of these SCAs, but at the same time allows us to aggregate this data in a way that would be useful for identifying and prioritizing investments, and also for kind of research purposes, right? So to better understand, how do these projects become so important, and why are they so widely used, and things like that. And so I'll pause in just a second to see if there's any questions. But before I do that, I just want to mention that our first effort from this was released back in February, before the world kind of went sideways. But we released what we called a preliminary report, because our plan is to release much more detailed information, but we wanted to put something out to kind of show what we had found already. And this report's publicly available at that URL. Jenny, I don't know if you want to throw it into the chat so folks can take a look at it. But I'll just highlight a couple of the major findings, right? So the first was, these are some of the most widely used packages across, the data that we were seeing from these SCAs. And we did find that, perhaps unsurprisingly, JavaScript kind of dominated a lot of what we were seeing. So we decided to release kind of 2 top 10 lists. One is of everything, and one is of non-JavaScript, right? So because, again, JavaScript kind of dominated it, which is important for us to know and understand, but we also wanted to make sure we kind of gave a broader view into what else is being used besides JavaScript. So these, this is all in that report. These are the top 10 of each of those buckets of packages. And then in addition to, kind of that list, we also thought about, we came to some kind of high-level findings around from the work that we did as well. And so for that, a couple of these high-level findings that we really, kind of bubbled to the surface while we were doing that. The first, which I'm sure everybody has come across at some point in their experiences, but is inconsistent naming, right? So even as we're talking to all these different SCA vendors and aggregating all this data, it was no small feat to actually figure out, okay, async from this vendor, it means async / whatever from this vendor, and kind of and standardizing these, or this inconsistent naming is certainly something that is not only just a kind of, an accounting type of problem, but it actually also a serious problem from a security standpoint, given that if you don't know what packages you have, how can you know, when you need to update stuff? And so that was one of the high-level findings that we discussed in the report. The second is that a lot of these projects that, again, bubble to the surface as super highly used, are hosted under individual developer accounts on GitHub or in other places. And so, of the top 10 most used packages, 7 of them were actually hosted under individual dev accounts. And so there's a couple concerns. One, security measures may not be quite as stringent as kind of project level accounts. And then also, of course, we always have the fear that somebody gets run over by a bus and then the whole project falls apart because it's all hosted under an individual account. So that was another thing that was a bit of a surprise, perhaps more so than the first finding, but certainly something that is a concern going forward. And then lastly, again, this is something that, we all know is a problem, but actually is something that we're able to quantify here. So legacy software is, alive and well, perhaps not well, but is alive and widely used within companies and the software that they're developing. And so this has a variety of security concerns, but also can lead to, time and money costs, from associated to switching away from this kind of legacy tech. And so thinking about that and really not only thinking about it, but actually being able to quantify, what's going on there. And in this preliminary report, we didn't quite have the ability to, in this first pass for a couple of reasons, to identify the actual versions of the packages that are being used. But now that we have more SCAs involved, our hope for our next version, and that kind of brings me to the next steps for this, our hope is that we'll be able to kind of release a bit more information about actually version level package information, because that is pretty important to also kind of not only just think about, what do we need to do to update the most recent versions of the software, but where are the packages that are, widely used, but are mostly kind of these legacy versions. And so we should be encouraging people to, to update those ones in particular because they're so widely used. So the next steps here on this are thinking about, bringing in more SCAs, which, as I mentioned, we've already started to do, and we have more than the last when we released that preliminary report. And then also we're doing some network analysis to layer on top of this, so that we can think about not only kind of the importance based on usage, but also the importance based on, what are the packages that every other package builds on across the open source ecosystem. And so how do we think about kind of weighting those as important, even if they're not necessarily directly used themselves. And so our goal is to release an updated kind of report in February 2021 that gives more details and more usage data that can be both used for research purposes, but also, as I mentioned, for better targeting in security investments and other types of investments in open source. And so I'll also mention, and I'll pause for any questions or anything. This, in certain pieces of the world, this report, created a bit of a buzz in terms of what we found, and our hope is that the next report, or our plan is that the next report, because it'll be more detailed and more in depth, will continue to create a discussion and really highlight these types of problems that that we're considering with the census, but also that the OSSF is starting to focus on as well. So I'll pause there. I'll just go back to next steps, but I'm happy to answer any questions that anyone has.
I immediately have a ton of questions about this.
Please.
Yeah.
Not talked for so long and let people jump in sooner. But Christina, go ahead.
Yeah. So I recently wrote like a pretty big grant proposal for the Python Software Foundation to get someone full-time working on CPython, doing like kind of custodial work, like reviewing pull requests and triaging issues and all that. And on this list, I only saw JavaScript packages and things that looked like Java packages. So my question is, like, who are these SCAs? Like, what is determined to be an open source package? Like, what about open source packages that are used like commercially? Yeah, I just did not recognize any of the non-JavaScript packages or have used them at all. And I didn't immediately identify any Python packages or even like CPython.
Sure. And one of the things with both Java and JavaScript is that often the packages tend to be smaller, right? And perhaps in Python there's larger libraries that are used, and therefore sorry, the opposite, and that can kind of skew the weightings, right? And that's why actually we want to be able to release a much more detailed and kind of lengthy list of the packages for exactly that reason, because there's definitely Python stuff that shows up in, say, for example, one of the things we focused on was kind of the top 200 on the back end. In the report, we only ended up releasing the top 10. But in the top 200, there's definitely some Python packages there as well. And I think that's, a couple of things go into that. One is, just who the SCA's customers happen to be. And so the more SCAs we get, the more companies we'll see, and the broader kind of breadth of this we'll see. David, if I recall correctly, you had a couple thoughts on that back when we put the report out. Did you want to? And I noticed you're off mute, so I'm going to cold call you to jump in there.
Oh, I'm happy to. Yeah. We had done some preliminary analysis and really came up with the same thing. And if you read the report, you can blame me because I pointed out to Harvard the same kind of issue that we had identified. I've forgotten the exact numbers, but something like half of all the JavaScript packages have 0 or 1 function. So you're talking, so in the JavaScript world, it's quite normal to have something like is odd. And the only thing it does is not is even. And so, and that's a funny example, except it happens all over. And because there's a huge number of packages with each of which are often very, very tiny, it tends to skew when you start counting just number of packages that other packages refer to. The JavaScript numbers become huge. And so, in fact, in the report, they separated JavaScript from the other ones, partly because of that. But I think that's also fair, and we don't have as much insight into the SCAs But I suspect in many cases when the SCAs are paid to do an evaluation, it's going to tend to be things like, for example, a larger Java package, say. And so there's going to be some emphasis on just what are the customers paying for. Um, Frank, I think might be very important to explain why you need a third SCA, because you have two. You are
Sure.
you have a legal agreement for a third, though the data hasn't arrived yet.
That's correct.
But
Well,
I think that's important to explain why, because I think we're hoping for more to be released soon.
that's right. So so just to from a privacy standpoint, the what prevented us from releasing more details in that kind of first preliminary report was that at the time we only had two SCAs involved, and obviously if we released usage statistics that were the aggregate of two things, then both of those companies could subtract their own numbers and figure out information about their competitor, right? And so we were trying to avoid that from happening. And now, as David alluded to, we have a third signed up and signed all the paperwork signed, and we're in the process of getting their data as well. And we have a few others that we've been talking to that are in the pipeline as well. So that our hope is, come January 1st, so we can get a dump of all of these companies' data for the calendar year 2020, so that our next report we can release more details, because any individual company won't be able to subtract out their own numbers and then and figure out what their competitors are doing, because that's part of the problem with this is that these companies are all competing against each other, and this is to some of them this even just this usage information is actually very important to to their business model. And so we need to be respectful of the fact that these companies are basically giving us for some of them this is kind of their crown jewels of information under the agreement that will make it public, but that we will in the process protect their clients first of all, and also their kind of their secret sauce and what's going into it from their perspective. So Christina, I realize that was kind of a long-winded answer to a fairly straightforward question, but the tighter answer is, in the more detailed report, there will be a broader set of kind of languages that are represented. It just so happens that in these current in this existing analysis, those were the ones that bubbled to the top.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just not sure what role a report like this would play in identifying critical projects. I find the conclusion that I am drawing from this is that a package that has 2 lines in JavaScript that is called isArray needs will get resources to develop that functionality, whereas literally core Python, the Python programming language, is not on this list.
Yeah, and I think that's the report, and in the report itself, we talk about this to some degree, and I think it'll be even more so in the next report. But this has to be taken in context, right? And so isArray, okay, that might be widely used, but we can, with a tiny bit of effort, we can say, okay, it looks fairly secure and people are have done what needs to be done. But with bigger projects, that's I think the context is more important to the fact that, for example, Python is much more wide, or perhaps hard to say what more widely used or less widely used, but is a much bigger behemoth, and therefore may require more resources to kind of address these types of concerns.
Yeah, and if I remember, Frank, for this report, you only focused on language level packages. So core Python wouldn't show up because it's not in that list. That said, I think there's 2 issues. One is, what are the likelihood of unintentional vulnerability? And the other is, what happens if somebody takes over the package and inserts something malicious? isArray is not very impressive as far as JavaScript goes. On the other, in terms of size, and nor should it be. And you wouldn't expect many changes, but if somebody inserts something malicious there, that could impact an incredibly large number of sites around the world.
That's right.
So I think there's 2 different contexts.
Well, I think the thing you're talking about too is like not a technical security concern. It's just social engineering. And we see that all the time in every programming language ecosystem, right? Like an unknown developer approaches a package maintainer and they're like, hey, add me as a maintainer. They push some commits, you're pwned.
That's right. That's right. And but to, you know, to be to be more clear about what we're attempting to do, we're attempting to take a pretty broad level of view of what security is, right? So it's not just, you know, is there a buffer overflow in here or something like that, right? But is there, you know, the bus problem, right? So if, you know, if the main developer gets run over and nobody else has, you know, access to the repository, then, you know, then we have a left pad situation, right? Like where, you know, that's a problem too from a kind of different angle in terms of security, right? And so we are trying to take a rather broad view of security, and even, you know, we'll talk about the survey in just a second, but from that, like if people just stop contributing to this project because everybody gets bored with it, but it's still a super important project, well, that's also a security, you know, kind of issue, and in a different way though, right? But absolutely, that's, you know, a piece of what we're looking at.
And real quick, shameless plug on that last item, Christina. There's another working group in the OSSF called the Developer Identity Working Group that is focused on tackling that exact problem because it's something we're all worried about. I'll drop the link to that one in here as well. We meet next week.
Excellent.
I have a question that's similar. It's a little bit related, but just at more of a high level, like how do you work with these SCAs? Like, are you paying them to do the work? One of our goals would be to actually get more updated data, like you mentioned, you know, make sure it gets updated, you know, at least once a year. But if we wanted to even keep it updated more real time, like I'm just thinking out loud, you know, are they using like standard tool sets? Is that even possible? Can you talk about any of that?
Yeah, no, I'm happy to talk about that. I mean, that type of stuff is probably not in the report because that was the, you know, the back end struggles of what led to the report. Yes, so structurally, we are not paying them. They are, you know, doing this for basically publicity, right? So we're you know, we offer them the opportunities to kind of release the report in a co-branded way, right? So they can put their logo on the report and say, you know, we were a critical part of putting this together and giving the data. And also, you know, in many of those articles I mentioned, the press hits, they get a shout out in, you know, the press hits too. And so they're doing it out of, you know, the goodness of their hearts and free press, right? And so that's, you know, always kind of a tough motivator, especially for some of these SEAs, or at least some of the ones we've talked to are actually rather small. And so the kind of personnel effort that it takes to, you know, you think about what they're giving us, right? In their records, they have kind of who their customers are and lots of kind of detailed information. And so they need to take the time to strip that out, but do it in a way that we can still kind of, you know, that the data is still useful to us. And so they are investing, you know, person power and moving this project along. And so, yes. And then on our side, we have funded through the seed funding came from the Linux Foundation, and we're looking for broader kind of support as we go. But we have some folks on our side that do the data analysis and bring all these different data sets together. And to your question about kind of, is this standardized? The answer is no, because, you know, all these companies, you know, they you know, manage the process and the way that they collect the data differently. They store the data differently. I mean, this is, you know, if you've ever done anything with multiple companies, you know, they all do it differently, right? And that's exactly what's going on here. Now, to your point though, we would love to, and originally our thought was try and do this quarterly, to, you know, release kind of a regularly updated cycle. Then we, you know, started to try and do it, and we decided to back off to yearly, at least at the start, but absolutely a more frequently updated list or kind of, you know, statistics is absolutely something that we would love to do. It's just a matter of kind of resources on our end, right, and also the resources on these companies. But I think that, you know, as we've kind of gone through this process, now that, you know, the companies that we've worked with so far are familiar with what we need, they can kind of automate it moving forward, right? And so that's why, our goal is to kind of get everything set up so that on January 1, they can, run a script and that does everything that it needs to do and sends us the data. And we have 2020's data and we can put that all together across the different SCAs and then release, the reports not too long after that, right? And so the hope would be that at some point it becomes so automatable that we can do it more frequently, whether it's quarterly or monthly or, as frequently as feasible.
Are you incorporating data from other sources like public social coding repositories?
Yeah, so that is the answer is for the preliminary report, no. But our plan is to indeed kind of, so it just ended, but the Debian like PopCon, process where they tracked kind of downloads of projects through Debian and things like that. We are definitely open to that and to including that type of material. At the moment, we haven't, and so we've, in the report, we kind of clearly say like, there are other ways to do this. This is the way that we felt would add the most value because most of those data sources, or at least add the most value at the beginning, because all those data sources are public, and we're trying to bring kind of some of the private data sources to light in a way that, shines some light that is not, that is currently behind closed doors, right? But absolutely those, more kind of aggregate data sources that are public are things that we want to pull in eventually.
Is it possible from the SCAs to get information about more than just developer libraries? So I'm curious why the focus on that seems like a kind of a big gap, big miss there, because there are a lot of core components. There's Linux, there's Python, a bunch of core components that don't get identified. So what the best way is to bring those. Because for this working group, we're thinking about securing critical projects. We really do want to have a sense of, across all of the open source projects.
Certainly, yeah. Thanks, Kay. That's a good question, and that's we're in some ways we're almost too granular, right, in terms of the level of analysis that we've been looking at, and that's based on kind of the data sources that are available to us, right? So the SCAs, they're measuring things at the package level because their primary concern is license violations, and so that necessarily has to kind of go down to these super package levels. And so when we think about the larger projects like Linux or Python or as Christina just mentioned in the chat, Rails, right? These projects. Even if we say, okay, Python needs a lot of investment, well, which pieces of Python need a lot of investment, right? That's still kind of, the goal with this type of project is to help give more granular insights into, what needs help, right? And so, to that point, something we would envision, eventually, and this is again more just kind of resource limitations than anything. But you could potentially say, okay, we have this giant list of these kind of smaller level packages. Just show me the stuff that's in Python, right? Or just show me the stuff that's part of the kernel and things like that. So that if what you care about is that larger project, you can still use this in a way that helps you kind of drill down and see which pieces of that larger project are, in this case, the most used and most relied upon, at least from the viewpoint that we have.
Okay.
Excellent. So if there's no other questions at the moment, I'll jump in and just talk briefly about the survey and where we are with that, because as I mentioned, this isn't only about kind of the technical part of the problem. It's also about the human part of the problem. And so we launched over the summer a survey of open source developers to basically try and answer a number of questions related to both security, but again, this kind of big picture view of security in terms of, you know, the sustainability of open source and these kind of open source packages. And in particular, we focused on the packages that came to the surface through the census, and because we wanted to really focus on you know, some of those most critical packages, but we didn't only focus on that. We just tried to kind of oversample folks that were working on those packages, and we also did a lot to focus on maintainers, right? So the critical folks within these within these projects that are doing a lot of the work. And so we wanted to think about everything from you know, demographics of, you know, who are these people, where are they located, and things like that, but also thinking about, you know, what can we do to avoid burnout of maintainers as well, and thinking about, you know, the relationship with payment, right? Because, you know, when open source was born, there was, you know, a massive pushback against any money being involved in it. And now, obviously, that's not, you know, the case, right? So there's, I remember hearing a quote one time that, you know, money would ruin the open source ecosystem, which may be true in theory, but we were, at least at the moment, proving that it's not true in practice, right? And so how do we think about, you know, the role of money in the open source ecosystem? And then also, lastly, as I mentioned, we want to also thinking about how folks are getting their knowledge around security and best practices and things like that, so that we can think about ways of reaching out to them and encouraging them to, you know, better, to kind of use better practices. So we haven't really gone through, we're in the process right now of analyzing the results of the survey, but just to give you a few kind of high level notes, you know, so we ended up seeing more than 2,500 unique open source projects, because we asked people specifically, what projects do you work on, knowing that many people work on more than one project. And we asked them specific questions about the different projects that they work on, including, you know, their level of involvement, right? And so of the respondents that we have, almost 464 are maintainers for at least one open source project. And so again, we kind of focused on these maintainers because in particular, we wanted to know, you know, those are in many projects, the critical folks, and kind of we wanted to understand, you know, are they getting burnt out? Do they have too many requests on their time? And what can we, very broadly speaking, you know, what can we do to help those folks out, to prevent burnout and to prevent them from just, you know, throwing their hands up and saying, I can't do this anymore. You know, I'm going to go do other things, right? So, so we have over 1,000 total responses. Not all of them, you know, the survey was rather in depth, and so not all of them finished the survey. So we're still kind of sifting through all of that, but we know that there are at least 600 or 700 people that completed the survey in full, and we think we can use some of those folks that only completed part of the survey and some of their information as well. So, like I mentioned, this ran over the summer. We did, you know, kind of try to promote this in a variety of ways, where we, you know, we had a bunch of different articles about it. David and I both went on a couple podcasts. And so we really tried to cast a pretty broad net in terms of capturing folks on different projects at different levels of contributions, and kind of across the globe. We sent, the Linux Foundation was kind enough to kind of advertise this through a bunch of their mailing lists as well. So that's what we think, you know, kind of led to this broad coverage of a variety of projects, but also this kind of great depth of high level folks as well in terms of the maintainers. So as I mentioned, we're in the process of reviewing the survey results now and you know, parsing through them. And our hope is to, around either late September or early October, release the results of the survey and what's going on there. So I will pause again there and just curious, obviously, you know, there's less to kind of talk about and hang our hats on there, but curious if anyone has any thoughts or questions on kind of the survey.
So maybe not as much of a question, but this is, I mean, this is very cool. I don't know if you have access to our agenda doc today, but we are kicking around different ideas for how we can help open source projects, through this working group. And so I'll be curious, super curious what some of those results are on the survey, because we're thinking about this as like a menu of sorts, like, hey, I need help with this, or I need help with that. And we know that every project's a bit unique, and it's not all one size fits all. So super excited to see the results when this comes out.
Yeah. And that's exactly what the goal of this was again, in the census, it was kind of mechanically, what are the widely used projects, but in the survey, digging into, okay, what are the problems that these folks are facing, the maintainers, the core developers, and even the kind of, there's been a lot of, research has shown that in open source, it's kind of this power law distribution, right? Where there's a handful of folks that do most of the work. But that long tail is actually important as well, because they're the ones that are kind of finding random bugs or doing small little things that help with the kind of sustainability of the project. So we wanted to be able to kind of separate, what are the cares and concerns of, kind of the constant contributors versus the kind of long tail, and how do we keep them all kind of engaged and coming back and things like that. So great, glad to hear that.
Cool. Yeah, sorry, I didn't give a bit of an intro on the OSS app. It seems like you've heard a bit from David, how we all came together to help improve security. So this working group specifically is my goal is to do sort of exactly what you've been talking about, is identify these critical projects that are used throughout the world, and then figure out how we can help and support them. So this is very much in line, and I hope we see you guys around and figure out how we can work together on some of these issues we're trying to tackle next.
And I think, I think that's the thing, is that I'm at a business school, and this is, I think the role of businesses in open source and the future of open source is clearly becoming much more important. And and there's all these kind of not separate, but everybody's going towards a common goal. It's just a question of kind of how do we prioritize and how do we focus our resources. And I think that's, our goal with this project is really to help answer that piece of the question. Each company, everybody that's on here knows what projects are most important to them. And that's important, right? Like I mentioned at the beginning, that when the EU did their bug bounty program, they focused on the projects that were important to them. And that's great. That's good and that's important. But what, can we give a kind of more global view as well? And I do think that, the integration of kind of these cross-company organizations that like the OSSF is going to be particularly important to that, because it gives us a place where we can all kind of safely say, here's what's important to us, and kind of aggregate that information up, right? I mean, like I mentioned, my background was in cybersecurity, and I worked with the financial services ISAC, which is one of the information sharing analysis centers. And that was such a big benefit to be able to safely kind of share this information. It's not like that's like the core secret sauce of what makes Google successful, or IBM, or whoever, but it is important to the health of the whole ecosystem. And so we're happy to kind of engage with this group, and as it as it decides what direction it's heading, and hopefully be able to add some direction and on that as well.
Very cool. Thank you. Any other questions for Frank or Jenny? Yeah. Cool. All right. Well, thank you so much for the presentation. We have a couple more topics that are very related on our agenda today that we can try to get through quick. I just mentioned the first one, so I guess I'll just skip to that really quick. Is Dan started a doc, and there's a link in the agenda for a brainstorming session of the menu of services that I was just mentioning, like, what types of things can we do for projects? And we've seen a few different models. We've heard some don't work as well as others. So if you're interested, click on that doc and start adding just some ideas there. And then I think when we get some of this survey data, we might be able to expand this a bit more. I guess I could.
Yeah, so just for a little bit more context there, Kim and I at Google are working on budget stuff for next year, trying to figure out how much money we have available, working with other companies interested in contributing money to this cause. And so at the same time, we're working on how we would, different ways we could make that money useful to projects. So you can help us brainstorm on that. That'll also help us make our case stronger to get more money made available here, and be creative. It's not just as simple as writing checks. We're going to have to figure out how to put the money best to use.
I have a question for David related to the money topic, and this is also related to the core infrastructure initiative. So I know that the core infrastructure initiative currently, so we're looking at trying to bring the core infrastructure initiative into OpenSSF and kind of continue on that mission, but make it be one integrated effort. So the core infrastructure initiative currently does fund some work on some projects. So I know it does fund the Linux, some Linux security work. David, are there other projects that the core infrastructure initiative is funding now, or?
Probably, and that in fact is one of the things I'm going to try to dig out.
Okay, all right. Too soon to ask.
Right. But for example, there's and some of this is not clear, under what rubric. So for example, whether or not you call it under the CII or just the Linux Foundation, there's 2 audits involving the Linux processes, and there's also efforts to try to eliminate warnings from the compilers, because right now, if you compile the Linux kernel, there's an endless number of warnings that people have started ignoring, which is a bad idea. So, work to fix those means people will start paying more attention to them, which is good. So I know those at least are going on, and I'm hoping to dig out and find out what else is up.
Okay.
As an alternative to the methodology, which presumably is proprietary, used by SCAs, are people here familiar with TideLift or Librariesio? It's an open source tool that ranks packages according to a variety of open metrics across different programming languages. And if we could consider that as part of identifying critical packages.
Yeah, so that's a great point, and if the group doesn't already have hooks in, TideLift's actually based in Boston, and so we've talked with them a bit as well, and before the pandemic set in, we were talking with them. But yes, indeed, we used their librariesio to kind of set the base for a lot of what we were doing, because they've done at least kind of advanced some of the naming issues and things like that. But I agree that TideLift is an interesting model, and I think it's again, it ends up being kind of individual companies, what is important to you, which is a valid way to go, but it's only kind of the tip of the iceberg. So but they are doing some interesting work, and they're continuing to grow as well.
Yeah, in fact, under the CII, we actually, when we did an early preliminary version of the census too, we actually contributed back some fixes to librariesio because they had a number of bugs as we were trying to gather data from them.
I think it would be cool if TideLift could show up and give a similar presentation. So Christina, I don't know if you have good connections. I know a few people there, but happy to send out an invite and see if they're interested in joining us for a future meeting.
Yeah, I can put out some feelers too.
So quickly, one other agenda item I wanted to make sure we got to today was we talk about the critical projects. Well, one I think that we can all agree on is Linux. We have through the Linux Foundation, there's some contracted work that's going on to help with the Linux kernel security efforts. Is Sasha on the call that maybe wants to speak a bit more to this? So basically, we're trying to make sure that we can make sure that these types of roles are sustainable and funded long term. So
yeah, I'm here. So right now we have a few of these parallel work streams going on. We have one person that's funded via the CII and is doing more work around tree-wide refactoring and just removing classes of issues out of the kernel. And we have a few parallel work streams that are basically based on interns and such, and younger folks who are fixing bugs found from security tools, so like a system called fuzzers or various sanitizers, and we kind of work with them to fix those bugs. And we're basically looking to bring all this work into this one, one house. We're kind of trying to rehome the work we've been doing under one organization, and to continue the work that's been happening under CII. And that's why I'm here.
Cool. So, someone gonna say something? Amir?
Yeah, I was gonna say as well, Amir from OSTIF here, that we've also been involved in in one of those projects as well with improving Linux, and so I was hoping, I think in the coming weeks we'll definitely have more results. So I would love to chat with the group about that and kind of talk about how we made that happen, if that's okay with everyone.
Yeah, absolutely.
Cool. Yeah, I'm thinking maybe by either our next meeting or maybe the one after that, we should have more results or at least more talking points. So.
Okay. Cool. Yeah, Sasha, let's keep that conversation going and see if we can, raise some funds or through the OSSF and make sure we keep Linux secure.
I guess based on Kay kind of asked a question before, just how do we keep CII work going even though CII kind of stops?
Right. Yeah. So I think we'll probably, Sasha, the best way for us to continue this conversation is in the context of bringing the CII into OpenSSF. And we need to think about how to move the things that they're currently funding, and as we're doing that, we can look at consolidating efforts like the work that's funded through CII and the interns that are funded through the Community Bridge program. So.
Right. I think just consolidating all of that under one roof will just benefit the progress as well, since we're doing a lot of scattered things now, but then if we work under this work group, we can benefit a lot from future ideas, thoughts, plans. It's just worthwhile to continue this work under this work group, I think.
Cool. Yeah, let's see if we can make it happen. Awesome. So sorry, I went backwards up the agenda. The last thing that we had on for the talk today was the working group mission. Did someone else add this? Maybe I added it from last time, but yes, we should kind of come up with a collective mission together with this working group. We can start a new doc with ideas and throw things on there and then discuss next week if that sounds good to people.
That sounds good.
Cool. Okay. So then homework for next time is take a look at that services menu of services doc, and then also we'll noodle on a mission for this working group together. Yes, thank you, Jenny. Cool. Any other last minute things? No?
I wanted clarification on what the relationship between this working group and other working groups would be. In the last meeting, we talked about setting up a Slack channel. I opened an issue in the repository, and then someone responded that we need to coordinate with other working groups before we decide to use Slack, and that just seemed like an odd response to me.
There is a Slack now.
There is a Slack.
Who responded?
Yeah, so feel free to create a channel if you don't already have one, and if you need help, I'm happy to set that up for you as well. But yes, you don't need to wait to use Slack. And as far as coordinating working groups, at the TAC level, we're kind of driving that to make sure everybody's coordinated. But certainly the output of this group will be beneficial to other groups, and likewise, other groups will probably drive some work that could be used by this working group. So and we can chat more specifically about how that interacts, but we're working at the TAC level to create the overarching strategy, and we'll see how each one of those working groups sort of fit in. So hopefully we'll have a doc soonish that we can publish to everybody and make that a little bit more clear.
Yeah, but to quickly clarify, my understanding was that the TAC just briefly wanted some time to coordinate the same way for all the working groups to communicate, and that's now been resolved. They have basically it's mailing lists and Slack are the primary quick communications, as well as obviously people can share information with Google Docs or whatever, but the primary ones for discussions were mailing lists and Slack. Yes,
correct. Yeah, we wanted to use the mailing list for like official communication, and then Slack can be more casual conversations.
I think the
How
key
was the
thing.
Slack channel communicated? Like, I didn't get an email on the mailing list.
I think we just got it a couple days ago. I just replied to the issue with it now. I'll add that to the README. It went out on the TAC mailing list. I think Ryan sent it.
So I actually grabbed the main list of everyone and manually put emails in there. So if I missed you, I apologize. And it's also, I'm not sure why you wouldn't be on the main mailing list, but we'll kind of resolve that. I've also asked LF for a way to have, to be able to email everyone in OpenSSF for things like this in the future so that we don't miss out on folks. But certainly feel free to share it amongst your working groups, and hopefully we'll catch everybody eventually.
Cool. All right, well, I got to run. So thank you, everyone. Good seeing you. Thanks again for the presentation.
Thanks all.
Take care.
Thank you, everybody.
Appreciate it.
All right, bye.